I'm going to read three papers this morning. You have copies of papers 2 and 3. You don't have a copy of the first one because there's no texts in the first one. It's a conversational essay, and I figure that you can just listen to it and get as much as you would if you had it in front of you. The second and the third paper are scrutinies of translational situations. The first one examines the opening strophe to Césaire's 1956 Notebook of Return to the Native Land. This is probably his most single famous poem. We now know that there are 4 versions of this poem, and with A. James Arnold, who is the leading Césaire scholar in the world, we have translated the 1939, which is the first version of the notebook, which any of you who are interested in Césaire might like to examine. It was published by Wesleyan last year, and it's a much different version of the notebook than the 1956. By 56, Césaire had become much more political than he was in the 30s. And in the 30s, he was sort of a young, African-influenced French surrealist. And once he became involved in politics, became a congressman and the mayor of Fort-de-France and represented Martinique at the assembly in Paris, he edited and revised a lot of his early work. Most of us now think that the editing was a mistake, that the earlier work is much richer than the midterm work. Arnold and I have also translated Sole Coup Coupé, the title comes from Apollinaire Zone, which was published in 1948, and which is probably his richest single collection of short poems. He, in effect, gelded that book in the 50s, turning it into Cadastre, another book, and he eliminated over half of the poems and revised most of the other poems. And it's really a hatchet work on the Sole Coup Coupé collection. So we've translated the original one now, and Wesleyan also published that in 2012, and it's called Solar Throat / in English. The third paper is on Césaire Vallejo, and it's an examination of the first poem in Vallejo's most difficult book. It's really a groundbreaking book. It's like language poetry before language poetry was even considered. It's called Trilce. It's an invented title. The word doesn't exist in Spanish. And the first poem, I call the paper Translational Understanding of Trilce 1. And so I'll read through it with you. And I think, especially with the second and third papers, you'll have everything that I could tell you about the responsibilities of the translator and the differences between good translations and poor translations. I'm happy to be interrupted and ask questions or make comments at any time you want to. I won't read the original. In the second and third papers, there are some original texts because my pronunciation is imperfect, and I feel embarrassed not being able to speak like a Frenchman or a Peruvian. Okay, but you have it. You will have it in front of you, and those of you who read French or Spanish will have everything. So I begin then. Or do you have any questions before I begin? I'll begin then with the paper that was written in 1986. It's called The Translator's Ego. This is the conversational one that doesn't have any text in it. In his introduction to my selected poems, 1960-1985, Elliot Weinberger, a very fine translator, by the way, who only lives a few blocks from here, writes, "As for translation, the dissolution of the translator's ego is essential if the foreign poem is to enter the language. A bad translation is the insistent voice of the translator." That's a beautiful statement. My first experience with what I think Weinberger means by the translator's ego was with Ben Bellett's translations of Garcia Lorca's Poet in New York in 1959. Bellett appeared to be imposing his own poetic voice onto the Spanish texts when, for example, He translated the last line of Lorca's poem La Aurora, como recién salidas de un naufragio de sangre, as though lately escaped from a bloody disaster. Lorca's shipwreck of blood, naufragio de sangre, Lorca's shipwreck of blood, a powerful direct image that needs no translational revision, had not only been lost but turned into English slang. Bellett's bloody, as in, he's a bloody good bloke, neatly effaced Lorca's blood. In the case of Bellett's Lorca and Neruda translations, we hear the translator poet's own mannerisms leaking into and rendering rococo, the meaning of the original texts. It is as if Bellett is colonizing the foreign terrain of these poets instead of accommodating himself to the ways in which they differ from his own poetic intentions. The image of a translator colonizing the foreign terrain of an original text has somber implications, especially in the case of a first world translator working on a third world writer. By adding to, subtracting from, and reinterpreting the original, the translator implies that he knows better than the original text knows, that in effect his mind is superior to its mind. The native text becomes raw material for the colonizer translator to educate and reform in a way that instructs the reader to believe that the foreign poet is aping our literary conventions. Bellett, of course, is not alone in such activity, although his imposition seems more monolithic and damaging than of many other translators. When Robert Lowell drops out 10 of Rimbaud's 25 stanzas in translating Le Bateau Ivre, one of the great poems in the French language, there seems to be a presumption that only 2/3 of one of the greatest poems in the French language is worth carrying over into English. Sid Corman, at times an extraordinarily fine translator, has a tendency to eliminate repetitive phrases and to drop articles. This appears to be a manifestation of his own poetics, which have led to the short, terse lyrics that he's well known for. I, too, am guilty of ego imposition. For example, in my 1968 translation of Vallejo's poetry, I rendered the line, pero me busca y busca es una historia, as, but she looks and looks for me. What a fucking story. The Vallejo poem in question here is made up of a series of anguished lamentations on the failure of his wife to connect with him. During the first 8 years that I translated Vallejo, I was unable to connect with Georgette Vallejo, by which I mean that she constantly blocked my work with the excuse that no one could properly translate her late husband's poetry. After much effort, by a fluke, Grove Press gained permission to publish the translation. One afternoon, I was sitting in Gil Sorrentino's office going over galleys. When I came to the poem in question, I read it to Gil and complained that the last line, at that point rendered, but she looks and looks for me, what a story, lacked punch. By that point, Vallejo's Es una historia was not only loaded with his consternation, but had taken on the symbolic weight of my struggle with the translation and with his widow. My memory is that after a moment's reflection, Sorrentino threw up his hands and exclaimed, what a fucking story. And in a giddy moment I said, that's it, and added the intensifier to the line. I was wrong to do so. And when Jose Rubia Barci and I retranslated the poem 6 years later, we took it out. I've gone into a little detail here, not to excuse myself, but to suggest that a translator's impositions upon his text are not necessarily a worked out plan to create a new tone or meaning for the original. Were Lowell to be here, he might explain, probably not to our satisfaction, that he left out all those stanzas because he was unable to render them to his satisfaction. Corman might argue that by cutting here and there rather than adhering to the original at every point, he had made a sharper and not really unfaithful version in English. So, how might a translator work to resist ego imposition, or, at worst, translational imperialism? For the fact is, there is no such thing as a literal translation of a poem. Denotative choices come up in every line. There is a constant process of interpretation going on, regardless of how faithful one attempts to be to the original. When the original poet is available for questioning, a certain amount of denotational guesswork can be eliminated. When one is translating the great dead, or out of contact with the author, the only indicators come from the text at large, and the way key words can be identified relative to the author's background. While translating the Martinican Aimé Césaire with Annette Smith, I visited Césaire several times, always with a few pages of specific word questions. Given Césaire's busy schedule, it was never possible to ask him all the questions that came up in translating him. So many tricky decisions had to be made on the basis of the text itself. As an example, Smith and I occasionally came across the word anse, A-N-S-E, which can be rendered as bay, cove, creek, or basket handle. Since Césaire's poetry is very specific to Martinican geography, and since the entire island is pocked with bays and coves, which led to such place names as Anse Pilote or Grand Anse d'Arlet, etc., the obvious choice here seemed to be bay or cove, assuming that the context of a particular poem does not call for a handle reading. Yet in the 1969 Berger-Bostock translation of Césaire's Notebook of a Return to the Native Land, we find Les Antilles qui ont faim, bourgeonnant dans frêle, translated as the hungry Antilles delicately sprouting handles for the market. Not only has the surrealist Césaire been falsely surrealized, but the translators have backed up their error by adding an explanation to the reader as to what these handles are for. When Smith and I retranslated the Notebook in 1976, we rendered these phrases as the hungry Antille burgeoning with frail coves. In the case of Vallejo, I learned not only to check my work with Peruvians and Spanish scholars, but to check their suggestions against each other and against the dictionary. I worked to find word-for-word equivalents, not explanatory phrases. I also respected Vallejo's punctuation, intentional misspellings, line and stanza breaks, and tried to render his obscurity and flatness, as well as his clarity and brilliance. An unsympathetic reviewer of Barcia's in my work, John Simon, exclaimed, quote, "Eshleman has tried to render every wart of the original," end quote, which is in fact exactly what we had tried to do, to create in English a non-cosmeticized Vallejo. As a poet translating another poet, I let my sense of our relationship with Vallejo and his poetry enter my own poetry, so that the translating activity in the context of an apprenticeship was envisioned and critiqued as an aspect of my own evolving poetics. Over the years, I constantly tried to skim my own imaginings of Vallejo off the surface of the translations and let them ferment in my own poetry. I came to understand that if a translator does not do this, he runs the risk of building up an imaginal residue in his translation, which, with no outlet of its own, spills into the text. The thing is, imagination is always present. We know this when we try to remember and write down a dream upon waking. As we try to remember, we forget. And in the flux, we reorganize, imagining the dream into a writing that ends up locking the nebulosity of psyche into a fixed grid of print. In a similar way, our imaginations are active as we move one language into another. As we read translationally, we risk revising the original to reinforce our dream of a poetics that might hold its own against alternative poetics. All the poets that I have spent long periods of translation time with, Neruda, Vallejo, Artaud, Césaire, de Guy, have drawn me because I felt that their poetry knew something that my poetry wanted to know. Besides attempting to make accurate, readable versions, I was also involved in a secondary plot or subtext, wanting to shovel some of their psychic coal into my own furnaces. Since translation is such slow work requiring multiple rereadings, it can require a more prolonged reading in depth than when we read poetry written in our own language. As the translator scuttles back and forth between the original and the rendering he is shaping, a kind of assimilative space is opened in which influence may be less contrived and literary than when drawing upon masters of one's own language. The kind of influence I have in mind here involves becoming porous to the character of the original and to the various ways in which it resists or does not resist being transformed. Thus, in the case of Vallejo, I do not think of myself as having been influenced, at least not directly, by his Marxism, his Christianity, or by his own indigenous influence, which, since he was a Peruvian Sierra Cholo, gives his writing much of its austerity, anxiety, and immutability. No, in Vallejo's case, I believe that it is his capacity for contradiction and the consequent complexity of viewpoint that has been the fuel. He offered me not merely ideas and stances, but a way of receiving and twisting the blow of the world. Any questions or comments on that piece? I mentioned Elliot Weinberger in the beginning. Elliot Weinberger is a very fine translator. His translations of Octavio Paz, the great Mexican poet, are by far the best. Okay, then, let's go to paper 2. On the first strophe of Aimé Césaire's Notebook of a Return to the Native Land. This was originally given as a lecture to a seminar at the Naropa Institute in Boulder, Colorado in June 2000. I would like to engage the translation of poetry by scrutinizing the charged opening strophe of Césaire's notebook. I will first comment on some of the strophe's key words and present an estimate in my translation of it. I will then consider 2 differing translations of this strophe. The first is from John Berger and Anna Bostock's translation of Return to My Native Land, Penguin Books, 1969. The second by Emile Snyder from his version of Return to My Native Land, Présence Africaine, Paris, 1971. Annette and I had the advantage of having these 2 previous translations to inspect and to differ with. From our viewpoint, our translation does not represent a definitive or unchallengeable version. It is simply the best that we could do in the late 1970s. Since then, we've made changes in our translation of the notebook several times. The version of the opening strophe presented here is to be found in Notebook of a Return to the Native Land, Wesleyan University Press, 2001. That book is in print and maybe even available here today. I'm critiquing Berger, Bostock, and Snyder to help the reader evaluate word choices and strategies in translation. Annette's and my theory of translation can be put very simply: to make a translation that is as accurate as possible to the original, as well as one that is up to its performance level. These two pursuits are often quite not compatible. To translate accurately, especially literally, often results in a wooden English-American version. So, translators constantly fudge or reconstruct, taking liberties, as it were, with the original. Many of the translations of poetry that I have any familiarity with significantly distort the original and offer something that is neither an accurate version nor a poem that could be considered original, as Robert Lowell's imitations once were in the second language. Aimé Césaire's poetry is an especially good test of a translator's ability. It is metaphorically dense and packed with technical and arcane words, as well as some neologisms. Césaire's syntax is also complex, and to render it faithfully and intelligently sometimes involves acrobatic strategies on the translator's part. So here is the opening strophe of A Notebook of Return to the Native Land in the original French. So I'll pause here for a second and let those of you who have some French read through this. And then following the opening strophe, there are translations of some of the key words so that you can keep these in mind when I make my comments about how it might be handled. In the seventh line, Tourterelle has been misspelled. There's a T missing after the T-O-U-R. Typo.
It's Moignon, the third line.
Yes, that's based on monk, which is monk, and the suffix could be translated as little monk, but little doesn't quite pick up the derogatory implications. We translate it as petty monk. Petty monk. Yes, I probably should have included that in my word list. Thanks for pointing it out. Okay, note that this strophe consists of 3 sentences. 2 short commands followed by a long looping sentence made up of 8 phrases. In other words, beginning with puis je me tournai in line 3 of the original, that is 1 sentence all the way to the end. And so one of the challenges for a translator is to maintain that syntactical integrity and to keep it as a single sentence at the same time that one renders it in such a way that is accurate. Here's our translation of this strophe. Beat it, I said to him, you cop, you lousy pig, beat it. I detest the flunkies of order and the cockchafers of hope. Beat it, evil gree-gree, you bedbug of a petty monk. Then I turned toward paradises lost for him and his kin, calmer than the face of a woman telling lies. And there, rocked by the flux of a never-exhausted thought, I nourished the wind. I unlaced the monsters and heard rise from the other side of disaster a river of turtle doves and savannah clover, which I carry forever in my depths, height deep as the 20th floor of the most arrogant houses, and as a guard against the putrefying force of crepuscular surroundings, surveyed night and day by a cursed venereal sun. a real charged piece of writing. Huh? The reader will note that in the first line we had to make some adjustments that while they do not alter the meaning, they depart from a literal translation. Both flic and vache are slang for policemen, with the latter a bit more insulting. Gueule is an animal or fish mouth that when applied to human beings is often translated as mug or in context trap, like shut your trap. You cop, you lousy pig, stresses the oral nature of the challenge. Now, let's look at the Berger-Bostock translation. Get away, I said, you bastard of a cop. Swine, get away. I hate the livery of order and the fish hooks of hope. Get away, foul juju, bedbug of a monk. Then I turned to dream for him and his lost ones paradises more calm than the face of a woman telling lies. Rocked there on the breath of inexhaustible thought, I fed the wind, set monsters free, and heard a river of turtle doves and savannah clover rising on the far side of disaster. A river in my depth, as deep as the brazen 20th story is high. A river to protect me against the corruptions of dusk that are paced day and night by a damned venereal sun. Although there are a lot of things that can be questioned here, I will only concentrate on material that seems clearly distortional. For example, while va-t'en can be translated as get away, such a phrase implies a gesture that I don't think Césaire is making. And swine get away doesn't strike me as spoken. In other words, you can't imagine a person in a heated state of emotion saying that phrase. There are other tonal discrepancies in the translation that could be addressed. On a more serious level, the second part of Césaire's first sentence, which becomes a new sentence in the translation, offers livery for Larbin and fish hooks for Aneton. It seems clear to Annette and me that Césaire is addressing people with the word Larbin and not the uniforms they are wearing. As for fish hooks, it appears that Berger-Bostock have misread Aneton for hameçon, which does mean fish hooks. This is a real bad error on their part. At the end of their third sentence, they translate moinillon as monk, which is only partly correct, as monk is moine, and moinillon is little monk, or possibly in this context, a pejorative term for a monk such as petty monk. Berger-Bostock's fourth sentence, which is the beginning of Césaire's third, adds the word dream to dream for him, which does not exist in the original. The addition complicates a phrase that is quite clear in the original. Césaire is saying that he turns towards paradises that are lost for the French colonist, a kind of combined Copt priest. Not that, as Berger-Bostock have it, that he is dreaming for him and his lost ones' paradises. In Berger-Bostock's fifth sentence, the original at this point is still building up momentum in its third. Breath is an inadequate translation of effluve, which combines both effluvium, there's a typo there, both effluvium or emanation with discharge. Here the word seems to stress the speaker's being rocked by an implied dream of paradise, which he opposes to Martinique's social stagnation. I think the reader will see that Césaire's long, winding third sentence has been seriously altered by Berger-Bostock. The word river is arbitrarily repeated twice after imposed colons. After the third river, Césaire's powerful phrase, the putrefying force of crepuscular surroundings, which is simple to translate, has been rewritten as the corruptions of the dusk. Lastly, arpente has been translated or mistranslated as paste. My hunch is that Berger Bostock, on the basis of the fishhook's error, hameson instead of hanekton, employed a lot of guesswork in their translation. To avoid such errors and to track down words not to be found in the dictionaries that Annette and I consulted, I met with Césaire twice in Paris, each time bringing a word list to go over with him. He very kindly met me, and we would walk from the office of the publisher Présence Africaine to a coffee shop and sit in a coffee shop, and I would sit there and ask any Césaire in French. I had to speak French with him because he didn't speak English. I somehow got through it. I'd ask him all my questions, and he would give me as many answers as he could. But I was also asking him questions about things that he hadn't considered for maybe 30 years. And so at times he said, well, I have to go back and check an African-French dictionary for that one. So I'd have to wait until I came back the next time to hear about that. On a third occasion, Annette and I met with him after having completed a penultimate draft of our translation. At that point, we had reduced our problematic word list to about a dozen words, and we rejoiced when we left his son's apartment, having finally solved all of our word problems. In a few cases, Césaire had to reconsult French African dictionaries that he had not looked at for decades. The other version of this opening strophe is by Emile Snyder, a now deceased French poet and translator who lived for many years in the United States. It was through Emile's translation of Césaire's prose poem, Lynch I, that I discovered the poet in 1960. Lynch I is from Sole Coupé, or now in our translation, Silver Throat Slashed. While Emile's English was fluent, conversationally speaking, he was still translating into a second language, which is much more difficult than translating a second language into one's first. Here is Snyder's version of the strophe. Go away, I said, with your mug of a copper, your mug of a pig, go away. I hate the flunkies of order and the beetles of hope. Go away, you evil charm, little punk of a monk. Then I turned toward heavens lost to him and his own kind, heavens more calm than the face of a woman who lies. And there, lulled by the effluvia of endless thoughts, I fed the wind, I untied the monsters, and heard rise from the other bank of disaster a river of turtle doves and the clovers of the savannah. I still carry deep inside me at inverse depth of the 20th floor of the most insolent houses, and as guard against the putrefying power of ambient twilights, surveyed day and night by a cursed, poxy sun. Snyder has tried to match word for word most of Césaire's first line. The phrasing is somewhat awkward. One cannot imagine an infuriated Martinican shouting this line at a cop. And with copper, we have a dated British word for cop. Cockchafer is generalized into beetle. Césaire is always extremely specific regarding fauna and flora. Here, the cockchafer's destructiveness to vegetation seems to be a key element in the word choice. So it's very important in this instance to use cockchafer and not just beetle. Punaise de moinillon is rendered as little punk of a monk. Snyder prided himself in being up on American slang, and here you have an instance in which his hipness, as it were, led him to substitute a rhyme for a more accurate rendition. I would also question translating it paradis as heavens, especially since the word has heavy Christian overtones, which paradise does not, and also since Césaire's writings contain many anti-Christian images. Snyder repeats heavens in the following line, proposing that they, and not the speaker, are more calm than the face of a woman who lies. It strikes me that endless thoughts deflects the crucial implication of une pensée jamais lasse, or a never exhausted thought. For us, the implied meaning here is the speaker's refusal to give up his dream of paradise or freedom. That is the engine of this strophe and much of the 40-page poem that follows. The rest of Snyder's strophe, with a few exceptions, is passable. The clovers of the savannah is a little awkward. Ambient twilights lacks the force of crepuscular surroundings. And poxy, while evocative of venereal diseases, could refer to other pox diseases such as smallpox or chickenpox. A strong cognate like venéreenne is hard to improve on. Okay, so that's the end of that one. And again, I pause, and I'm happy to respond to anything you might care to bring up. Yes?
I have a question. You worked with a co-translator?
Yes.
How did you find this person, and can you talk a little bit about how that collaboration?
Oh, well, yeah. Well, Annette Smith is a Pied Noir from Algeria, a French speaker. And she was a professor at Caltech, the California Institute of Technology in Pasadena, California. My wife Carol and I moved from New York, where we had met and were living, to Los Angeles in 1970, and I was for 2 years on the faculty of CalArts, California Institute of the Arts. Annette was married to a man named David Smith, who wrote a book on the poet Diane Wachowski, who was an old friend of ours, and I met Annette through Diane. And she was looking for projects. She was teaching French at Caltech, and she was sort of bored just teaching the French language in the classroom. She wanted to do something else. So I suggested, after having discovered Césaire on my own in translation, that we translate Notebook of Return to the Native Land. I was at that point teaching in an African-American high school. I had a grant from the California Council of the Arts to go into this high school and teach poetry for a semester, which was quite an experience. And so I decided that with Annette, we would translate Notebook of Return to the Native Land as a kind of a present for my students at the African-American high school. So we decided to do it together. And we found out that we worked quite well, but we didn't get it done in time for the end of the semester, so the students never got it. But when I reflect now about what I was doing, I mean, the students were so basic in their understanding of metaphor and so on that they would have just been sort of overwhelmed by the Cesaire poem. So it's probably good that I didn't, foist it upon them. So we worked well together, and we decided we would continue to translate Cesaire. There was a lot that had not been translated, and we were critical of all of the existing translations. So we had this combination of situations to deal with. So I got in touch with Cesaire, and as I mentioned in the paper, I began to visit him and to ask questions, and we continued to work up through the 80s. And at that point, I stopped translating Cesaire, and there was a period of time in which I didn't have any contact translation-wise with his work. And Annette was much older than I was, and we lost contact. And I figured that she was no longer really working hard. She's now in her early 90s. She lives in Los Angeles. So a man named A. James Arnold had been a Césaire scholar, and he continued to work on Césaire, and he has now become the main Césaire scholar in the world, including France. And he has recently edited the complete writings of Césaire, which is an 1,800-page collection of poetry, theater, essays, and lectures, and published in Paris. So Jim Arnold and I are now revising all of the translations that I did with Annette Smith in the 70s, adding our own new work, and we're going to do a complete poetry of Aimé Césaire, which will be about a 900-page book, bilingually, that Wesleyan University Press will publish in 2015 or 2016.
The name of that
A, it's initial, A, period, James Arnold. If you see Solar Throat Slashed or the 1939 original Notebook of Return to the Native Land, both books published by Wesleyan, you will see that his name, and he's the scholar, and so he writes the introduction to the books, and I write notes, and we work together on the poems. It's a great relationship. It makes translating much less lonely to work with someone. You know? And as a self-taught French reader and Spanish reader, I can never, unless I just simply dedicated, a 10-year chunk of my life, I can never learn these languages well enough to work on people as difficult as Vallejo and Césaire by myself. And so this is why we have these teams.
Are these teams a new trend in translating in America?
Not necessarily, no. You all may know of Pound's Cathay, which is really one of Pound's most beautiful books. His translations from the Chinese. I don't remember the year that it was published, in the teens, maybe, in the early 20th century. But Pound didn't know any Chinese. The book is remarkably accurate, given Pound's situation. But what he had was a literal trot that someone had prepared for him. And working off of a literal word-by-word translation of the Chinese, he composed the poems in English of Cathay, which were a breakthrough for him into a kind of conversational English poetry, American poetry, I should say. If you read real early Pound, it's like something out of the 19th century. It's old-fashioned rhymed English verse. But all of a sudden there's a new Pound, and the new Pound comes through in Cathay. It's really quite amazing. The most famous poem is The River Merchant's Wife, which I'm sure some of you know, which is one of the most wonderful poems in early 20th century American writing. So, no, I think that from time to time, it depends on, for example, Elliot Weinberger translates Spanish because he's bilingual, English and Spanish, but he also translates Beidao, Chinese poet, and he works with a Chinese scholar, because while he has some Chinese, he doesn't have enough Chinese to translate by himself. So there you have a case of a person in one situation works by himself, and another situation works with a scholar. I think it depends on what your situation is. And I think one should be very humble. If one is not really bilingual, then I think it's best probably to work with a native speaker, to find the right person. When I was working on Vallejo in my early days, and when I lived in Peru at one point for 9 months, and I would sort of grab people and ask questions about Vallejo, and I was constantly misled because people didn't understand Vallejo, the Peruvians didn't understand it, and they would make up things when I asked them what the word, and then I would think, oh, thank you very much, and I would write that down, and then 6 months later I would find that it was cuckoo. So you want to find a person who is smart and bilingual, hopefully, and honest, and will say, I don't know. We don't know about that. We'll have to research it or talk to somebody. So does that answer your question? Good. Anything else on this particular project? Yes?
Another question. Did Cesaire himself ever express any opinions about the different translations of his poetry in English or other languages?
I don't know. I've never spoken with him about translations into other languages. I know he's been translated into probably at least a dozen languages. The Notebook, Calle do Retiro Pai Natal, is really a famous poem, and more famous in Africa probably than it is here. And it was sort of hailed as sort of like the anthem of blacks who were attempting to come to terms with their culture and destiny by many people. So I imagine that the Notebook has been translated into 25 languages. But that wouldn't really concern me because most of those languages I don't know anything about anyway. Um,
I want to thank you for giving your words about pound because I'm doing an American tribute to the world in Paris at Marché de la Poésie.
Yeah?
And I chose pound, and I have been in awe with Americans' viewpoint. You're gonna do that. The pound, and he's very well known worldwide and acclaimed.
Do you know Richard Seaberth?
Oh yes, and I translate
Well, that was
Jean-Luc Steinmetz, the great portrait of France.
Mm-hmm.
But
Okay.
But they have no qualms, and I think they would be very disappointed in me if I didn't include pound.
Who would be disappointed in you? The French?
The French listening to an American.
Well, they would
expound
probably
as a
be open
tribute.
to you choosing another poet if you preferred to do Marianne Moore or
Oh, goodness,
Wallace
no.
Stevens or
Oh,
Hart Crane. How about Hart
no.
Crane?
Oh no! I'm gonna do Mahmoud Darwish because he passed in Houston, Texas.
Oh.
His American translator was born in Austin, Texas, where I went to school, and I was born.
I see.
I pick people that not like that.
Well, Hart Crane is my favorite early 20th century American poet.
No good.
Oh. And from my point of view, the poem Lacrimae Christi
Mm-hmm.
is the great 20th century American lyric poem,
Well, I'm gonna
for whatever that's
I'm
worth.
gonna do Annabelle Lee.
Oh, hell.
Well, because they like Poe.
Poe's prose is so much more interesting than his poetry.
And then the Morgan Museum had that wonderful exhibition of Poe and Mallory and Baudelaire connected with Poe.
I was invited by a Mallarmé scholar at Rutgers yesterday, Mary Shaw, who's dedicated a decade of her life to studying Mallarmé and has written very intelligently on Mallarmé. Her name is Mary Shaw. She's in the French department at Rutgers in New Brunswick. Anything else relevant to the Césaire situation, or anything about Césaire that you think that I might be able to respond to?
My question is translation itself. Could you comment on this idea of the translator as an author?
A translator as a loafer?
An author.
Author. The shoe, right? Who proposes the translator as author?
Well, every event I attend,
Yeah.
you know,
Who?
this is addressed. It's a sort of universal, saying about the translator as an author, because if you are not a good writer, you can't become a good translator. So I just want to know your
Well,
perspective on this idea.
I don't really think of the translator as an author. I think that plays false what actually goes on in translation. I think if you want to be an author, you simply have to bite the bullet and write your own poems or write your own stories or novels. Then you're an author. Because if you're moving from one language to a second, what you're offering, if you're doing accurate translations, is not your poem. It's not your poem at
You're
all.
right. You're right.
That poem does not belong to you as an author. You are a humble work person who's rendering language A into language B. And you may do wonderful work and you can be very proud of yourself for taking a lot of time and doing all of the work that involves in translating difficult poetry. But I don't think, my opinion, I don't think that makes you an author.
Do you think
I
that-
attended the Boston University,
The Bostonian.
Boston University Professors Translation Seminar.
And who is the professor?
Every spring, they open up to the public from other schools to attend, and they invite translators from all over the world. So one of them in particular, I don't recall his name, mentioned that sometimes a good translator can better the text, make the translation actually
Seldom.
better than
Seldom.
the original. So, as there are bad translations, there are also,
Well,
better
every so often
translation.
when I give a Vallejo reading, not very often, but from time to time, someone will come up afterwards and say, I thought that translation of yours was as good as the original. And that's a wonderful compliment, but that doesn't happen very often. And nobody's ever said your translation is better than the original,
that can happen. Well, that's my point. I think that can happen.
If it happens, it happens. I think if you're translating someone whose work is not as complicated as, say, Vallejo and Césaire's is, you might be able to pull that off. But I don't think that anything I do with Césaire or Vallejo is better than what they do. I think of the translator in a very humble sense. I think the translator is serving the original.
I have to.
Yes.
It's like a bridge going from the author.
Mhm.
There is like a bridge
Yes.
between the author and the translator.
Mhm.
But you can be the author. You can be an author by yourself, coming from the text of another author.
Mhm.
If you go that way, it is your own text. And it is like betraying, the author.
You see, what you should do, I think, in terms of this question, look at Imitations by Robert Lowell. This is a book that was published in 1962, and it has about 20 poets in it, including Rilke and lots of great writers. And Robert Lowell is doing what he calls imitations. Now, he called them imitations instead of translations because he takes monstrous freedoms with the translation. I mean, he will take a Rilke poem, and in a single line, there will be 3 changes. And so if he called them translations, he knew that he would probably be, attacked. But people treated the book as Lowell's own poetry. If you get the copy of the original publication published by Farrar Straus here, and you read on the back of the book, people are reviewing the book as this new collection of poems by Robert Lowell. I think that's really terrible, really unsupportable. This is the book in which he dropped out, a third of the stanzas of Le Bateau Ivre by Rimbaud, which is a killer of a poem and very difficult to translate. And the fact that so I don't think, in a sense, the imitations of Lowell, they don't really belong to Lowell because they didn't start with Lowell, and they no longer belong to Rimbaud or Rilke because they've been so disfigured. So it's sort of like they belong to no one, in my opinion. It's kind of a no man's land.
Just a final comment. I think this idea, what is behind it, is when you don't do a word for words translation, okay, if you decide to be faithful to the original text. So I think somehow you become an author, in a sense.
I follow
What
the
I've
reasoning there,
heard-
but I don't agree with it. Right. But think about that. Come to terms with
Thank
it
you
yourself.
Thank you for your comment. So I've heard a lot of different translators talking about this, and they all agree, and you are the one who disagrees. So I think.
Well, it may be that people who only translate and don't do original work themselves would tend to be more sympathetic with the position of the translator as author. But see, I'm primarily an author who translates, and so since I have my own body of work, then I think that is my authorship and not the translations. Yeah.
I wrote a poem in Puerto Rico when I was there on a project, and everybody looked at it. They all had comments. Nobody wanted to help with the Spanish or anything. Then people started translating, and every time I saw or read what somebody thought that I said, I knew right then and there about the words of the author. Of course, they read into it something, or thought it was something that it wasn't. And sometimes when it's your work being translated and you see, you have a deeper feeling
Oh,
about
yes, I
what
know.
are you toying with.
I know I've been translated a lot into French and Spanish, and translators send me their versions and often ask me questions, and I go over them. And big difference between good translations and poor ones. Yes.
Yeah, I've also heard this idea that the translator, the role is to improve the text, but I've only heard it from people who don't write in their own right.
Uh-huh.
And also, I sometimes hear it from people who translate what I think of as popular literature, that is to say, contemporary writers who are not great writers. So that may be another reason why people think that's their role. If you're translating an author whom you have a deep respect, then I think you have to see the role very differently, as you said.
Shall we go ahead then? Over the years, I have come to believe that while it is possible to do a fine translation of a single poem or a group of poems, translation that establishes an accurate and compelling image of a foreign poet can only occur through the translator taking on a complete collection and doing all of it, including the secondary poems that would probably not be included in an anthology. The translator is also responsible for scholarly research so as to bring to bear upon the translation as much background information as possible, especially in the case of poems with a deep structure but an opaque surface, such as one finds in Césaire Vallejo's Trilce. This research may make the difference between a coherent and an arbitrary translation. When I began to translate Trilce I in 1989, I collected all of the previous English and French versions and typed them up, with all of the same lines together. While I was working on a translation of this poem, 2 more translations were published. Here I offer 6 versions of the opening couplet of number 1 in chronological order. And I won't read these, but you have the paper and you can take it with you and look at it in your own leisure. Also, while studying these other translations, it appeared that none of their translators had taken into consideration 2 important information sources. Juan Espejo Asturizaga, Césaire Vallejo, Itinerario del Hombre, 1965, and Giovanni Meozilio's Neologismos en la Poesía de Césaire Vallejo, 1967. Asturizaga's book, still the only memoir we have of Vallejo's years in Peru, 1892 to 1923, offers some commentary on the relationship between events and poems. Meozilio's work, which has been critiqued and extended by André Cognier, Juan Larrea, and Amerigo Ferrari, analyzes neologisms in Vallejo's poetry, many of which are so subtle that without Meozilio's perceptions, they go unnoticed. In discussing my translation of Trilce I, I'd like to stress that without consulting these scholars' work, it is next to impossible for a translator to contextualize the poem and, armed with a viewpoint, do coherent translating. Asturizaga comments that number 1 is one of 8 poems that Vallejo wrote while incarcerated in the Centro Trujillo jail from November 1920 to February 1921, 112 days. He tells us that the inmates were taken outside to use the latrines 4 times a day, and that instead of allowing the men to take their time, the guard shouted at them, mocking and reviling them, while demanding that they hurry up. The first 2 stanzas of a later poem in Trilce, number 50, indicate that this is not gratuitous, but quite pertinent information. Quote, Cerberus 4 times a day wields his padlock, opening, closing our breastbones. With winks, we understand perfectly. With his sad, baggy-assed pants, boyish in transcendental scruffiness, standing up, the poor old man is adorable. He jokes with the prisoners, his fists jammed into their groins, and even jolly, he gnaws some crust for them, but always doing his duty. Cerberus, the 3-headed dog that guards the entrance to the Greek underworld, is here the jail warden. The 4 times a day that he wields his padlock must refer to the 4 times a day Espejo claims the men were taken out to the latrines. The second stanza is probably a commentary on the activities of the standing warden and the squatting men. While Cerberus is baggy-assed, sloppy but at least dressed, the men are squatting and straining, their forearms pressed down upon their thighs, hands doubled up into fists jutting down between their thighs. If we now look at the opening couplet from number 1, several things immediately become pretty clear that without Espejo and the backup information from 50 would be utterly puzzling. Who's making all that racket and not even letting the islands that linger make a will? It seems that the racket makers are the warden and the guards, and that the islands are the inmates' turds. If the latter is so, it determines how islas que van quedando should be rendered in English, not as islands that remain, but as islands that linger. The islands are in the process of being created by the inmates, and because of that, they do not refer to geographical formations, which would, of course, have been there before the racket occurred. A poet-creator is beginning to assemble his book, or the unique world of Trilce, out of his own body, in a way that may remind us of the Rig Veda, where a primeval being creates gods out of his mouth, demons out of his abdomen, the atmosphere out of his navel, etc. On one hand, the scene is primordial. It also makes me think of the painting The Third Day of Creation on the closed wings of Bosch's The Garden of Earthly Delights. On the other hand, it is an attempt to address and transform the absurdity of jail humiliation. Not only will the guards not let the men testify, they won't even let what they produce testify. In a rather childlike way, Vallejo makes the reader a gift of his basic and base situation. The second stanza slants the couplet's action off in a particular direction and complexes it. A little more consideration, as it will be late, early, and easier to essay the guano, the simple to capital ponk, a brackish gannet toasts unintentionally in the insular heart to each hyaloid squall. Guano, the dried excrement of seabirds, found mixed with bones and feathers on certain Peruvian coastal islands, was a widely used fertilizer of considerable value to the country. Espejo tells us that guano workers visited the mainland ports and cities on their days off, and that Vallejo would have been able to observe them, not merely in Trujillo itself, but in the vicinity of the jail. My encyclopedia informs me that a Pacific gannet is one of the chief producers of guano on the offshore islands of Peru. Thus, alcatraz should not be confused with albatross. Blue-footed booby is another possibility, but given the inappropriate denotations of booby, it is not a good choice. Pelican would also be an accurate translation of alcatraz, though to my ear it is less effective than gannet, which repeats, rather than carries, which repeats the hard A sound in the first syllable of brackish, gannet, ah. And while alcatraz follows the verb brinda, it is undoubtedly the subject of the verb, and not the other way around. Since brinda is intransitive, it probably means to toast rather than to offer. In line 4, as an apposition to guano, calabrina is archaic and means an intolerable, intense stench. If translated simply as stench, it reflects hedor, not calabrina, meaning that an archaic English word has to be found to match it, ponk. The demand here is to make the poem as difficult in English as it is in Spanish, to offer a translation, not an explanational gloss. The word modifying calabrina, tesoria, is even more difficult to deal with. Meosilio tells us that it is a neologism based on tesoro, treasure. He argues that the coin suffix incorporates the latter part of estacoria, excrement, influenced by the guano references in the stanza, and we can add by the activities alluded to in the opening couplet. But how render it in English? The simplest solution is to tack a bizarre suffix onto treasure, such as treasury or treasuria, or a bit more interesting, treasuria, intending to evoke diarrhea. The problem with the latter is that it turns the adjective into a noun, though I suppose one could try to live with treasurial. I do not see any reason to be literal in such situations. As long as one respects the original, a construction based on another approach is justified. Thus, I compounded fac capital and fecal as fecapital, which also fits nicely sound-wise, p-wise, between simple and ponk. I hope that the reader can see by this point that inch by inch sense is being made out of the poem as it is transitionally worked through. Uncommon sense, to be sure, but not non-referential language poetry. Trilce 1 is grounded in very specific and personal experience. As stanza 2 opens, the speaker appears to be asking those mocking him for a little more consideration. Not only is time passing all too quickly, it must be early in the evening, according to stanza 3, but with a bit of understanding, it might be possible to analyze what he is doing, producing, to assay it. This verb evokes the weighting, analyzing of gold, and this evocation will be reinforced by the play on treasure in the next line, as well as by the last line of the poem. The coupling of a vile product with gold suggests an alchemical transformation, or a way of looking at the creative process at large. As he continues to meditate, the speaker's ambivalence towards his activity deepens. In spite of jail humiliation, Vallejo may be changing the course of Spanish language poetry. Yet what he is doing, from the warden's viewpoint, is worth less than what gannets do on the offshore islands. their product is worth more as valuable fertilizer than his poems. Thus, the speaker is not only mocked by the guards, but by the gannets. As they shit into the gusting wind, they toast the human condition. They don't toast on the insular heart, they toast in it. Meaning, I think, that from the narrow-minded, illiberal viewpoint of the warden and the guards, art and culture are shit. If, as the fruit or marriage of the imagination and the world, writing poetry is the highest human activity, according to Wallace Stevens, at the wrong moment it can feel like the lowest. We know that the sacred is often the accursed. A sense of anti-value spins at the core of great value. Put in its most simple terms, the stanza argues that under the present circumstances, it is very difficult for a person to weigh what he means, thus perhaps more necessary than ever, with the implications that one is always, to some extent, facing the ass of nature. The request that opens stanza 2 is repeated, as if unheard, in stanza 3. A little more consideration and liquid muck, 6 in the evening, of the most grandiose B-flats. The absence of a verb after liquid muck makes the phrase abrupt, even jarring. Even if there were to be a little more consideration, the only outcome is liquid muck. One is left with one's own pile of islands as the evening comes on, a miserable squatting creature against a backdrop of the most grandiose B-flats. B must be added to flats so as to not evoke apartments. Well, I hear Beethoven in this line and almost translated it as of the most Beethovian flats to get rid of the otherwise to be added B. I also hear men farting in the latrines. Stanza 3 constricts and darkens the rich ambivalence of stanza 2, as if adjusting to the feelings that continued squatting in the darkening light brings about. Then, suddenly, it is as if the speaker stands up, and the peninsula raises up from behind, muzziled, imperturbable on the fatal balance line. In Latin America, the verb parar, to stop, in the reflexive, often means to raise up or to stand. I prefer raises up here as I want to anthropomorphize the peninsula as little as possible. For on another level, it is the augmentation of the islands in stanza 1. I understand por la espalda, from behind, as in such idiomatic expressions as hablar por las espaldas, to talk behind someone's back. Since the entire poem has been ass-focused, the raising of the ass in the act of raising up suggests the extent of the speaker's continuing preoccupation with that part of his anatomy. Meosilio suggests that in abozaleada, muzziled, Vallejo has substituted an EAR ending for a word with an AR ending, abozalada, muzzled. My slight adjustment evokes exiled, which in context seems not only acceptable, but fortuitous. In the last line, one can choose between equilibrium and balance for equilibrio. I much prefer the latter, as it harks back to the act of assaying in the second stanza. Something called an assay balance is actually used in the assaying of gold and silver. The balance line then relates to the beam of the balance scale, which is a line from which the balance pans are suspended. And we have been prepared for this last line, as the poem is occupied with the struggle to create an equilibrium against Vallejo's jail circumstances. What the artist leaves as testament to is the world he has created, and such a world must go back to the child's first creative act, with excrement sensed as a thing of value, simple for capital honk. At the beginning of Trilce's 77-poem peregrination, the end inherent, the mortality that contours all we do and are. You are dead, Sid Corman writes at the beginning of his book, Of. Speak now. If muzziled, be imperturbable. As if all imaginative expansion is posited on early physical constriction. As if my ship is in sync with my breath. Lips and sphincter, the body a winding cavern working a double peristalsis. All activity, no matter how grand, is underscored by physical leveling. We who, even with bountiful consideration, never go far beyond the liquid muck. I find much integrity in such a view, integrity to the actual as opposed to idealized human condition. Some may find number one a very negative poem with which to open a book. From an alchemical viewpoint, there is no philosopher's stone or gold without an impure, vilified product at the start to transform. Antonin Artaud. There where it smells of shit, it smells of being. 72 poems later, Vallejo will write, absurdity, only you are pure. Absurdity, only facing you does this excess sweat, golden pleasure. Well, I hope that Trilce one interests you enough to look into Trilce. It's quite a book, and it makes a writer like Charles Bernstein, a New York poet who some of you probably know or have read, seem a little old-fashioned. No, Trilce is a remarkable book. One has no idea how he got to it, because it's his second book. His first book, Los Heraldos Negros, the Black Heralds, is for the most part traditional Spanish language poetry, sonnets, rhymed verse. All of a sudden, Trilce appears as his second book, and nobody knew how to review it or even read it. He'd been smoking some dope. He used to go to the opium dens in Lima. So I think probably some of the thinking in Trilce may have to do with thoughts, fantasies, images that occurred to him when he was high. Because, you know, all sorts of stuff sounds really interesting when you're high. And most of us sort of drop that when we come down and say, well, that was that, but it doesn't really pertain to my life right now. But I'm thinking there may be some transfer of value. But on the other hand, Trilce number one, if you read it as I think it can be read, is extraordinarily coherent. It's not goofy. It's really focused. But if you don't pick up on the situation of the men in the latrines, you can read Trilce 1 and not have the slightest idea of what's going on. And some of these other translators have done that.
Don't you think that it is much difficult?
Sorry?
Don't you think that it is more difficult to translate prose in poem? Because in the poem, the imagination, you know, is, so I could say house, but it is myself, or, you know, the fantasy is so, you know.
In general, yes, but of course there's marvelous exceptions. I mean, have you ever thought about translating Finnegan's Wake? Or Ulysses, for that matter. Think what a journey that would be to translate Ulysses, as few people have.
Difficult.
Yeah.
What
So
about Tom Sawyer?
or Tom Sawyer.
Yes.
So I mean, I don't want to put poetry on some sort of pedestal and say, you know, it's the grand expression. I mean, there's many novels that are just as vital and powerful as any poetry. But poetry does tend to be more metaphoric
Yeah.
and to take more freedoms
Yeah.
than much prose, but not all prose. Certainly more than journalism, we say, or academic essays.
But when you find that kind of prose, they used to say that it is like a poetic prose. It is
Yes,
not a
that's
simple
true.
prose.
Yeah.
It is a poetic.
I just like the word poetic very much. You know, people at cocktail parties, oh, how poetic. You say something stupid and some guy goes, oh, how poetic. Vallejo's finest book is not Trilce. His finest, Vallejo left Peru in 1923 and went to Europe and never came back to Peru. He was in jail because he was accused of being involved in the murder and the burning of, the murder of a shopkeeper and the burning of a business in his hometown, where he had gone to be with his family on a holiday. We don't know to what extent he was actually involved in the burning of the business, but it seems as if he was somehow involved. So he was in jail because of that. They let him out while he was awaiting trial, and he left the country. And if he had come back to Peru, he would have gone to prison. So he stayed in Europe, and he lived for the most part in Paris, where he was extremely poor and had a very difficult life. He died at 46 in 1938. While he was in Paris, he worked on a book called Poemas Humanos, Human Poems, from 1925 to 1938. That is, I feel, his finest work. It's as original in its own way as Trilce is, but it's much more readable. And it's about being a poor man in the world that is on one level being rocked by revolution and on another level stagnant. And then near the end of his life, he wrote a collection of poems called Spain, Take This Cup From Me. The words of Christ on the cross. Let this chalice pass from me, or take this cup from me. Concerning the Spanish Civil War. He went there as a reporter. He wrote 15 poems about the war. They're very similar to human poems. And he came back to Paris and died of unknown causes, 46. So there's 4 books. Vallejo's complete poetry is 4 collections. Heraldo Negros, Trilce, Poemas Humanos, and España, Parte de mi Estacales. I hope you'll be curious enough to look into it. I've worked 40 years on Vallejo. Not without stopping. I mean, off and on for 40 years. And University of California Press published the translation in 2007, the complete book of Césaire. So, anything else? Yes.
The poem that you just take is very difficult, and would be difficult, as you said, for native speakers of Spanish, right? So it's I was not, in looking at this Spanish, I was not really thinking about the sounds of the words or the rhythm of the poem. To what extent do those formal or oral factors play a role in your translation, either in this poem or other poems?
That's a very good question, and it comes up in the translation of poetry constantly. I think that you cannot try to match in the second language the sounds in the first language or the rhythms. Once you start doing that, you start taking translational liberties and you start changing the meaning. I think the meaning is the most important thing to convey. At the same time, you want to try to figure out a way to make your translation as charged and as living as the original. So that's the challenge, to do accurate translating and to bring the energy and the movement of the language in the second language up to that of the first. And it's often impossible. And I mean, these two intentions often bang into each other. But that's sort of my theory of translating poetry. Thus, translating sonnets, for example, is impossible. Impossible. And in Vallejo's case, I had to translate a few sonnets. So I figured out ways to get near rhymes, half rhymes, as opposed to complete rhymes. And by using near rhymes, I was able to rhyme the sonnets without distorting the meaning, I think. But if you translate a sonnet and you rhyme it, as Lowell did in his imitations, the meaning goes haywire. You see? And so, for example, you know, Rilke, as a young man before the Duino Elegies, wrote mainly rhymed verse in German. And when Herder Norton translates his shorter poems, I think she's one of the best Rilke translators. She just translates the rhymed verse as free verse. It's not very interesting to read, sound-wise, in English. But at least it's accurate, and she's rendering pretty much what Rilke wrote, meaning-wise. But we still have a little time. If there's any other things you'd like to talk about, I'm happy to listen or to participate.
So I have a question about how translation affects your own writing. And you see, and as from when you began writing to your entire writing period, do you think that affected, over time, it affected how you express yourself?
Well, Vallejo has had an immense influence on my own writing, but I don't think that my writing sounds like Vallejo. But Vallejo gave me permission to try anything, to render an imaginative viewpoint of the world. He said, in effect, try anything, do anything, go anywhere. And there's a certain kind of courage that's being offered there. I mean, you know, I think with all of us who continue to read poetry, we find a lot of poetry just too tame or too ordinary. And I think one of the challenges in writing poetry is to find your own voicing, your own vocabulary, your own viewpoint in which you render this world into a new imaginative frame that, as it were, that translates, as it were. They're all writing on one level is a form of translation, right? We translate our experience in poetry. So I came to Césaire much later. I was more or less formed as a poet at the point that I came to Césaire. So Césaire had very little effect on my own work. Same with Artaud, but Artaud is so unique that anybody who tries to, as it were, imitate Artaud, it would just sound silly. I don't know if you know the work of Artaud, Antonin Artaud, the French poet, but he's an extraordinary figure in 20th century world literature. We should have an Artaud program during this week here. You know, he was in an insane asylum for 9 years, and he was absolutely crazy. And he went through electroshock in which they nearly killed him in electroshock. And his friends in Paris finally got him out of the asylum into Paris, where he lived for 2 more years and was quasi-coherent and wrote constantly, day and night, day and night. And still there's a ton of his work that hasn't been translated. And anybody who has good French or who has a scholar friend to work with, a wonderful project would be to do some of the Artaud that hasn't been translated. Because Artaud was able to somehow, even though that his mind was really destroyed, he was able to incorporate so much of his studies and his reading and his research as a young man in his later poetry. And we can't figure out how he did it. So for me, Artaud is one of the great lights of the 20th century. Now, I did a collection, I translated about 150 pages of the poetry. It's called Watch Fiends and Rack Screams. My translation was published by Exact Change, a little press in Boston that is more or less defunct now. They no longer pay me any royalties, so I have to assume they're defunct. And there's a selected writings of Artaud with a very fine introduction by Susan Sontag. It's mainly prose, but it's very valuable, and I would recommend the Susan Sontag. Helen Weaver is listed as the translator, but when I did a program with Susan a number of years ago, I said, were you involved in the translation? She said, oh yes. She says, I retranslated the whole thing. She said, Weaver did a terrible job. And I said, well, you didn't take any credit. She said, no, I didn't want to. She said, but I redid everything. So Susan Sontag's translation and her introduction, very, very fine introduction.
The theater and its double?
Theater and its double is an early text of Artaud's. It's a fairly conventional piece of writing by Artaud, but it's unique in the sense of the viewpoint, but it doesn't have the linguistic gymnastics in it that the poetry after his incarceration does. No, the theater and its double is, I remember, I think it was what was the inspiration for, there was a theater with Judith Malina, and I forget her boyfriend's name. Any of you remember that? There was a theater, they were very active in the 60s, and they did revolutionary programs. You would go into the auditorium and they would be shouting at people in the aisles, and they were doing things that were not considered to be, traditional theater. I forget the name of what they called themselves. The Living Theater. Thank you. Yeah. Did you ever see them?
No.
Yeah. The Living Theater. Yeah. They were inspired by Artaud. But it's an inspiration that's very difficult to manage, because if you don't really have an imaginative viewpoint, it just comes off as crap. Yes?
A question that just came to my head. What gets lost in the translation?
What gets lost?
Yeah.
Somebody has an
Because,
essay called Lost in Translation.
That's right.
I know Spanish very well, and I see that the grammar sometimes, for example, you can't transfer the grammar. You have to reshape the grammar.
Well, the sound gets lost, the rhythm of the language, probably an aspect of the local, an aspect, in other words, in Vallejo's poetry, for a Peruvian. The Peruvian would find things in the poetry that an American does not find in the translations. I mean, a quality of sound, of the way that certain words are used, etc. So there's a certain kind of loss of personality. I almost want to say a loss of soul, but I think that the soul can be protected in the translation if you work very hard to respect what the original author has done. So I wouldn't say that necessarily the soul, but the surface personality of the poem is in danger in translation. That's a hard question to answer. You know, I don't think there's any simple answer. I think we'd have to almost take a particular poet, look at translations of the poet, and then try to come to terms with what has been lost. It's hard to generalize what it is. But if you figure out what has been lost, please let me know.
Okay, connected to his question, what do you consider not translatable? Because all translators face this issue, right?
Well, Finnegan's
Some-
Wake is probably untranslatable. I think it has been translated, so I think that must have driven the translator crazy to translate.
During
I
the-
think that language poetry, the poetry by the American poets that call themselves language poets, I think there's a very funny poem by Charles Bernstein, who's an old friend of mine, in which he talks about a conversation with a Chinese translator asking him questions about his poetry as he translates the poem. And the Chinese translator is going crazy. He doesn't know where he is. It's as if his personality is in danger. Because the Bernstein poetry that he's translating is completely non sequitur and makes no sense in a commonsensical manner. I guess that would be my response to that, you know. I'm sure there's examples of literature that I'm unaware of. I don't read fiction, for example. I decided as a young poet that I only could read so much. And so there are certain things that I didn't have time to read, and I stopped reading fiction after I left the university. So I haven't read American or European fiction since the early 60s. Or travel books, or detective. I remember Diane Wachowski getting interested in detective fiction. I thought, oh boy, there goes her poetry. So I think it's very important that you determine early in your career what you need to read to do what you want to do. It may include some translating, it may not include translating. But you have to somehow get an eagle-eye view on the scene and see what you want to make use of what's been done, and then go deep into that and don't read for recreation, as it were.
So what do you do when you come across some words and phrases which you consider not translatable? Do you keep the original?
Well, if it's somebody that I'm translating, and I'm in the midst of translating a poem, you taking off?
No, we're going back.
Okay. You have to figure out a way to handle it. Or you have to give up and say, I can't translate that particular piece. There's a couple Artaud pieces that I didn't include in my translation because I was unsure of how to handle certain things. I mean, there's made-up language at times in Artaud. And you have to figure out a way in English then to make up something that doesn't sound dumb, that matches the crazy French. So yeah. Huidobro, Lake Huidobro is very hard to translate. You know, Huidobro is a Chilean poet of the Vallejo generation. His masterpiece is Alcazar, which Elliot Weinberger has translated. And most of Alcazar is made-up language. Alcazar is a real bitch to translate. It's as difficult, if not more difficult than Trilce by Vallejo. So anytime you get involved in translating something in which the language is made up, unless you really love it and are willing to go through hell to get it into a second language, best you just read it and say bye-bye. Well, thanks for coming over here. I enjoyed being with you, and I hope that this helps you.